Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. We're going to try to do the impossible. We're going to do like 20 boards in 30 minutes, and I will just please wave at me if I start rambling at hyper rates of speed. One of the reasons for today's presentation, it's somewhat of a follow-up from a couple weeks ago, but also somewhat of just this frustration of statements from our brothers and sisters on the left, from the president, even the comments this week of, okay, Republicans, where's your plan? Have you seen the numbers of bills that we have offered to take on inflation, to promote economic growth, to promote fairness, and none of them can get a hearing around here? And my point comes to something very, very simple. We intend to judge the left over what you've accomplished the last 15 months, and we'll make it to 2 years. Is the poor better off? The working poor better off? The middle class better off? Is the environment better off? Is the world safer and healthier? And then we expect you to turn around and judge us when we had the majority and the White House. Take a look at 2017, 18, 19, and we'll bookend the pandemic and judge us. And I actually believe you will see the policies we brought to this floor, to this country, made the poor less poor, the working poor substantially less poor, the middle class much more prosperous, and it didn't have the cruelty that Democrat policy has executed the last 15 months. And look, I'm not being hyperbolic. It is a crappy environment out there. But first off, it's just exhausting having to do this every couple months because of the willingness just not to tell the truth here by my brothers and sisters on the left. Once again, tax reform was done at the very end of 2017. Speaker after speaker, the speaker herself came to the floor and told us how this was a giveaway to the rich, that it was going to crash revenues, we're heading to recession. None of that was true. We ended up having a couple of years there before the pandemic, and I'm going to show you if we hadn't had it, how miserable the pandemic's economics would have been. The fact of the matter is, when we passed tax reform, corporate tax receipts, we don't call them revenues, we call them receipts, if you're on the Ways and Means Committee, went up 75%, far beyond CBO's early projections. The fact of the matter is individual income taxes were up 27.5%, and 80% of that was paid by the top 10%. Bit of trivia, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, and to my Democrat colleagues, our tax reform was more progressive, meaning the top tier of income earners were paying a higher percentage, larger percentage of the federal income tax burden than the previous tax system. Stop lying about what we did, because what we did was pretty darn amazing when you think about just the economic effects of income inequality shrank, food insecurity shrank, and we did it without inflation. Look, I accept there's a huge divide here. Democrats don't particularly like Republican policies. We obviously don't like theirs. Fine. Do you care about poor people? Do you care about the middle class? Then step up and just steal our ideas. We'll be happy to let you take them if it's good for America. But the crap that's been moved here in the last 15 months has just been cruel. So let's actually go back and once more time take a look at the actual math. If you take a look at the middle income, what was happening in that mean of our country, and this is adjusted to, I believe, 2019 dollars, so it's all consistent. You take a look at that growth, the opportunity, and you take a look what happened when we did tax reform. Just the incredible growth of income. And this is real purchasing power. This is adjusted for inflation. The fact of the matter is, take a look at these miserable years here during the Obama administration, where we basically just flatlined. And we stayed there. Yeah, the 2008 recession was brutal. Why did it take years and years and years and years and years just to get back to mean? The fact of the matter is regulatory policy, tax policy, trade policy make a difference. And you got to basically embrace something, and maybe this is where some of the left and right divide is. As a conservative, I believe growth is moral. I believe my daughter, the next generation Americans, deserve to live better tomorrow and the next year and the next decade better than they did yesterday. And instead, the policies of this administration, this Congress, you've made America poor. And once again, you take a look at what was being said here. The blue is what all the pre-tax reform trend line was. This is where we were going. We were all excited that we might get slightly over 2% GDP growth. And understand, when we talk about gross domestic product growth, it's a big deal because it builds on itself. It's like a staircase. And when you get another 1% here, 1% may not seem like a lot to you, but it becomes the new basis for the next year and the next year. And when you start to look at that over a decade, it starts being remarkable amounts of wealth that's distributed throughout society. And the red is what we accomplished by fixing the regulatory and tax system around here. The fact of the matter is, if you care about the middle class, if you care about the working poor, if you care about the society, if you care about our future, embrace the truth. Embrace that it worked. And if you want, say you could have done it better. But the fact of the matter is what we accomplished worked. And the thing is still, and this is taking a little bit to geekdom, and I'm sorry about that, but how horrendous the Democrats' forecasts were on accuracy, and how when Republicans took over the majority, we functionally nailed it. Matter of fact, we even for 2018, we substantially underestimated the amount of growth we were going to accomplish with our regulatory and tax reform. I know this may not seem important, but it is. Because once again, in this place, we play this game, well, CBO says this, but for some reason, when the Democrats are in charge of this place, CBO gives these projections and we never get there. When Republicans are in charge, CBO gives those projections and we touch them or we exceed them. And then we turn around and see the president and the Democrat leadership talk about it as if it was some dystopian time. It's just this bizarre place that being judged by what we actually accomplished, just as we intend to judge you and what you've done to this country. And you look at something, and this one's actually important because we're going through this right now. There's an argument that the inputs in inflation is basically, it's too many dollars, simplistic, too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. So you can do what the Federal Reserve is doing right now, which is basically squeeze dollars, squeeze liquidity out of our society. And it will drive us into a recession, and it will raise misery, and people will lose their jobs, but that's what's being required to get out the excess liquidity that the Democrats here, not a single Republican voted for it, did to this country. And there's a reason Larry Summers begged you not to do it. You know, big-time Republican Larry Summers, right? He begged you not to do it. You did it anyway, and you set it off. You basically took a flaming log and threw it on the kindling. And then you run around and say, well, it was Russia. Well, it happened, and I'm going to show you over and over here, it was going on before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to actually show you that your policies for years are what set off energy prices. But one of the inputs that if you want to tap down inflation, that we, as members of Congress, can do is you incentivize society, you incentivize industry to make more stuff. And some of the ways you do that is you get more of our brothers and sisters to participate in the economy. And the fact of the matter is that was also one of the miracles that we accomplished with tax reform, is the number of folks that came from the sidelines and came back into work because it became profitable for their lives, because there were opportunities. Once again, is growth moral? Because what we accomplished was pretty remarkable. I know it may be hard to try to get your head around some of these charts, but the fact of the matter is the spike we saw of people who coming back out of retirement and going back into the labor force, young people actually, I guess, dropping their video games and going into the labor force. And it didn't set off inflation. In many ways, what it did is help set off productivity. So we had those amazing wealth effects there, particularly in that 2018, 2019, first quarter of 2020 before the pandemic. And look where we're at today. Today we're now seeing articles that labor force participation, our numbers of brothers and sisters who are going to choose not to participate in the economy, who are going to take early retirement, not come back into labor, continues to leave us flatlined and leaving our country with the solution the left is going to give us for inflation is let the Federal Reserve drive us into a recession, because that's all you're giving us right now. This chart is absolutely fascinating for folks. Remember how Democrats believe they made people's lives so much better by functionally handing out cash? Did you know that our brothers and sisters had a hell of a lot more cash in their bank accounts before COVID? Because the amount of economic growth that was happening over here, they weren't spending it as fast as they got it. It was actually starting to go into their future retirements, their retirement security, their money for their kids' education. But the fact of the matter is the chart is the chart. This is the increases in household income, household checking deposits for the lowest 20% of quartiles. And I despise that term, but the fact of the matter, these are our brothers and sisters who are considered to be at the bottom 20% of the income quartiles. And you see this dramatic change in how much money they had in their checking accounts. And then over here you can see, okay, here's the blip where we sent out COVID money, and here's where they are today. You see where it's gone. Matter of fact, it's now lower than it was pre-COVID. This is the Democrats' great success in a Keynesian stimulus model of handing out cash. Our brothers and sisters now have less cash in the bank than they did before, when we were doing it through economic growth and not handouts. Our brothers and sisters out there, if you care about the poor and the working poor, you've made them poor. And if I get one more Democrat here who comes behind the microphones and says, well, energy prices is because of the invasion. Oh, come on. We all know that isn't true. How many times have there been votes on this House and every single Democrat voted to functionally no construction of new refineries, no constructions to even provide permits for new refineries, no new drilling? I mean, we have vote after vote after vote after vote, and this has been going on for a decade. And then you've all heard this discussion of when the Biden administration took over and they functionally took their regulatory apparatus and said, you give a loan, you're a pension system, and you invest in hydrocarbons. We need you now to file new disclosures on what you did for environment, greenhouse. What's your risk levels? You've functionally basically created this chilling effect for what we call the capital stack, the access to capital to extract and refine hydrocarbons. Okay, sounds a little geeky. So let's make this simple. It's not because of the cancellation of pipelines. It's a little bit. But it's not because of the lack of leases. It is a little bit. It is substantially because 2020, you had the collapse of the use of hydrocarbons because everyone's staying home. You remember we went to negative oil prices. Lots and lots of fields, lots of delivery systems shut down. A year later, we desperately need those back into shape, back into production. Democrats have taken over everything, and now they make it damn hard to get any money. Damn hard to put that field back into production. What did you think was going to happen? And the fact of the matter is, I'm going to show you in a couple charts. It's still a couple charts away. The pricing that we're paying today for heating and cooling our homes, for filling up our vehicle, was coming before the invasion. What Russia's doing to Ukraine just brought it forward by a few months. But it was already, you could already see it in the futures market. Don't you remember last fall, we were having discussions here on the floor of how people were going to heat their homes this winter? But once again, you're going to have a president and Democrats go, well, it's Putin's inflation. It's just not true. It's Democrat policy. And the fact of the matter is, think about this. When we functionally hit 2019 and going into the first part of 2020, we were energy independent. We functionally had accomplished the miracle that we had not seen for, 30, 40, 50 years. Imagine if we had that today. It shows you how much damage the left has been able to accomplish in, 15 months. And there's a great irony here. So one of the pledges of the Democrats when they were running in the last election and the Biden campaign and even the people who ran against me, we're going to clean the environment. We actually care. We're going to deal with greenhouse gases. But their lack of understanding of basic economics. So they do all these things, they screw up the capital stack, they screw up the ability to extract natural gas. Natural gas goes way up in price, and power plants all across the country have to convert back to coal. Congratulations, guys. Last year, America burnt 23% more coal. Because you raised the price of the dramatically cleaner natural gas so much, they had to convert back to coal. So when the environmental party, at least the party claims to be, but if you actually look at the math, Republicans' ability to get natural gas to the market cheaply and efficiently is what got us so darn close to those Paris Accord numbers just organically because we believed in economics. And they're the control freaks here that thought they'd control the energy markets. Sorry, guys. You made it much worse. You made it much worse. And the math is the math. And this is math coming from the Democrat administration admitting they made it much worse. And once again, if you take a look at the futures market, and this is long before the invasion, when you see these these spikes, this is almost a year ago. It was already coming because the constraint on supplies was already built into the policy of Democrat control of this government. The misery today, even though there's going to be this desperate attempt to say it's Putin's inflation and Putin's gas prices, it's just not true. And some of us were on this floor last, October, talking about we were already seeing this in the futures market. The only thing the invasion did is it just brought it forward by a few months. And then you wonder why you have inflation. So let's see. Left policies blew up the energy markets. Left policies financed massive amounts of liquidity and the incentive to functionally stay home and not be part of the productive society. Great, Democrat policies again. And you take a look at the misery index, which actually I really should do a calculation. I should almost go back and try to figure out You know, though in this misery index, we probably would just do inflation and how many people are living on the street and how many kids are dying of fentanyl overdose because borders open. That may be one of our coming projects. But the fact of the matter is, when the CPI calculation, and this is from just the last couple of weeks, is now well over 14%, and we're seeing food, energy, shelter coming close to 20%. And these are the core components. And this is year over year. This isn't the little transitory. Remember how we were promised over and over by the administration, my Democrat colleagues, it's transitory? This is year over year. This is your version of transitory? If you want to make Americans poor, what are some of the cruelest things you can do? Let's go back to our working poor. What are the two things you do to crush the working poor? Inflation and open up the border. Because you flood the population with individuals with similar skill sets, and then you make the core things you need, food and rent and fuel. If you're rich, which we know the Democrat Party now has become substantially an elite party, if you take a look at your money, it's rich coastal people that write the checks. Is what it is. And that working class, particularly the poorer working class, are just getting their heads kicked in. And the only solution we get from the left is, well, let's send them more checks, even though that worked brilliantly a year ago. And you start to look at fuel, 58.8. Gasoline up 43%. And you start taking a look at changes in food and shelter. In my community, I represent the population that's had the highest inflation now for a year, almost a year and a half. So the calculation that just came out, this last week, my community just suffered 11% year-over-year inflation. Last January, the year-over-year was 10.9. My community's gotten poorer, substantially poorer, because of Democrat policies. And now you start to think about, for that middle class, how much of their income actually just goes to buy fuel, or in this case, buy food. You know, you get the con job here saying, well, the core CPI says this. Okay. When you adjust core CPI, consumer price index, and you start to think about individuals of, if I'm in the working middle class, that hardworking middle class, or even some of the lower quartiles, the amount of your income that goes to that food and fuel and shelter, you start to realize across the country it's not 8.1 or whatever that number was as the national average, it's over 10. It's folks with assets, which is a bunch of the members here. They don't own houses, they own a second house, they own a vacation home. They're invested in real estate, equities. They own some REITs holdings. They're doing fine, because all those adjust with inflation. But for our brothers and sisters who are just trying to survive, we're kicking their heads in. And it's policy that came from the floor of this House that did it. And you start to think about the share of income now having to be spent just on shelter, when our lowest quartiles, or quintiles, however you prefer to say it, is now over 24.5% for our lowest quintile to basically just pay for their rent. And this is nationwide numbers. This isn't my Phoenix, Scottsdale number, where it's actually substantially higher. And so congratulations to my community. Democrats brought you 11% inflation. Yay. You know, after redistricting, I'm blessed. I have an amazing community. But my community voted for Joe Biden by a couple points. But they didn't vote for this. If you want to make someone it's retired, if you want to make a working person poor, do this. This is misery. And the unwillingness, there's an uncomfortable analogy, but I think it works. Anyone have a friend that they tried to help through being an alcoholic? And you took them to their 12-step meeting? And what's the first step? They admit they have a problem. My brothers and sisters on the left here won't admit they have a problem because they won't admit they did this. So let's start going over some of the brilliant policy ideas. And I only use this one as a simple example because it's easy to digest. So in the Democrats' Build Back Better, they've been speechifying to us about, well, supply chains are setting off inflation. We need more production. We do this. And then they slip in language into their own legislation that says, but you can't automate the ports because we're beholden to the unions. Think of that. The Build Back Better has a provision in there, slipped in, hidden in there, that you can't automate. The very things that the technology disruptions that make us more productive, that we can actually start to drive inflation down and get the wealth cycle back to our brothers and sisters here in this country, and they're more beholden to their union constituency than the working men and women of this country. And then the very last slide here. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, may I ask for my time?
The gentleman has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you. It shows you how fast you can talk if you've been just sucking down coffee all day. And I sometimes, and I should throw this out too, I've had the pleasure of sitting there when I have someone on the other side, and I know it's sometimes like fingernails on a chalkboard, and you are a good guy to tolerate because I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated that this body is not living up to what we're capable of. And there's lots of reasons and lots of excuses. But please, to anyone here, no more going behind the microphone and saying, but it's all paid for. The math up to this point of just what's been passed. This isn't what's proposed. What's proposed is off the charts. Just what's been passed. The left has functionally increased the deficit by $2.5 trillion. And that's actually using the much more favorable CBO scoring. So no more pretending, saying everything's paid for. It's not. And I guess the point, all I'm trying to do here is a simple point. Judge us as conservatives and Republicans, what we did policy-wise in that 2017, 18, 19, and the good it was for the country. Good for everyone. I mean, across the board. And then take a look at particularly the last 15 months. And I beg of my Democrat colleagues, reach back, figure out what we did that worked, steal the ideas, call them your own. But the country deserves so much better than they're getting from this body today. And with that, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.